Thank you. Thank you, Shane. Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome everyone to the Startup and Developer track. I hope the morning session was good and fruitful for you. I hope you had a good lunch. Shane introduced me already, so I won't do another introduction. I'll talk a bit more about the agenda later on. But first, I want you kind of like to imagine that you start your startup in a little garage somewhere, and you build a fantastic app, right? People absolutely love it. And then they all want to use it. Now what? Right? It's a bit scary, but it's happening to more and more companies. It's happening to a lot of companies that we see, and we try to help these people deal with that situation. I was actually in Bangkok speaking with one of our customers a few weeks back, and 3 days earlier they had launched their service on Amazon Web Services. They had it running on Amazon Web Services for a long time in Thailand, but they launched in the Philippines. And within an hour of going live, his infrastructure manager called him up and says, hey, we're under attack, something is seriously wrong. And they started looking into it, and nothing was wrong. They just had like 25,000 signups within the first hour. It was actually going really well. Now there's a lot of other companies that have been dealing with the same situation, that have been dealing with the success crisis. Does anyone know who this company is? Anyone? Yeah, Instagram. Awesome. Do you actually know how they've done it with only 3 engineers? Anyone? It's an easy guess. Yeah, they run it all on Amazon Web Services. So they've done an awesome job in really leveraging a lot of open source tools and running that completely on Amazon Web Services. Now you've had a presentation from Werner this morning talking about some of the building blocks that are part of the technology stack that Amazon Web Services offer. Now Instagram has been actually really smart in how they use the entire stack. So obviously we spoke about regions, availability zones, and edge locations. And to reach its global customer base, Instagram has been using all of those. One layer up in the stack, if you think about compute services, EC2, obviously they've been using those. They've been using our various storage options, EBS and S3 and so on. On the networking, to route to the right server clusters, they've been using the load balancer. They've been using our DNS server. And they've actually ran their Postgres database on Amazon, on EC2 as well. And even higher in the stack, they've been very smart in using not just content distribution, but also CloudWatch, our monitoring service, auto-scaling, and obviously very important, the libraries and SDKs, specifically for them, obviously, iOS and Android. So I think Instagram, like running a company like that with 12 people and then getting bought by $1 billion is the perfect example of a lean startup. Anyone familiar here with Lean Startup or read the book actually? Yeah, quite a few hands go up, and I'm not surprised because Lean Startup is a big movement at the moment. And we see a massive pickup for the concepts that are explained there, both in the US as well as in Australia and in India and even in China. We were actually spending some time on an event with Eric Ries in Australia a few months back and speaking. And one of the things he said on stage to an audience that we were addressing there is how cloud is like a fertilizer that creates startups. So what I want to talk about today is, first of all, how Amazon Web Services has impacted the venture capital landscape, if you like. Then I'll talk about how it's actually impacting startups, specifically how we impact it throughout the life cycle of a startup as they go from idea to demo or minimum viable product to scale and to monetization. And then I'll finish up with a quick chat about how we actually enable the startup ecosystem and how we're aiming to really be a catalyst for startups in the world, in Asia and in India specifically as well. So let's kick off with the impact that Amazon Web Services has been having on the venture capital community. There's a guy called Mark Suster. He's less known in Asia, but he's one of the most famous VC bloggers in the US. He has a blog called On Both Sides because he's on both sides of the table. He's been an entrepreneur. He's started a couple of startups and sold some of them to guys like Salesforce. And now for the last years, he's been a VC. And he's actually written a series of blog posts about how Amazon has been changing the VC industry. So I want to kind of like take you through that thinking. And to do that, we'll start with a bit of history, actually. Imagine that you are a startup in 1996, for example, before the .com. when you wanted to start your company back then, you would need to buy mainframes, massive servers. You needed to buy proprietary software. A lot of the money that you would spend as a startup would be spent on infrastructure and on software. And as a result, a typical Series A back then was like 5 to 10 million, like really significant, just to get going in an early stage. As you can imagine, it was very hard to innovate. Obviously, we saw a lot of innovation in that time, but it was more costly because you couldn't just try something out and with a couple of clicks move to another setup, which you now can do on cloud. So that was the situation back then. Then around 2000, there was the rise of open source. Suddenly, about 90% of the software cost actually went down because people started using open source, primarily the LAMP stack, right? Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. The only 10% of costs they still had were more around the support costs needed to support some of the open source they had. What happened? A lot more innovation and lower cost of actually getting your startup going. More money was spent on actually development of the application of the services, and unfortunately still on infrastructure. But you saw a big change in the value of or the amount of Series A kind of like dropped to about 3 to 5 million. The biggest thing happened around 2005. Enter the cloud. Like public cloud, kind of like spearheaded by Amazon Web Services around those days, really drove down the cost of the entire technology, of the entire operations. And suddenly there was an explosion in experimentation. And again, Lean Startup is a good example. That's why we're working with guys like Eric Ries, because he understands how experimentation and getting out with a minimum viable product and iterating quickly is actually enabled by the cloud services like the ones that we're offering at Amazon Web Services. Now, what happened to a typical Series A? It actually dropped to 500K, to 3 million. It's a wide range. It changes. I mean, there's still people. There was a big Series A round announced last week here in India, which was awesome. So it's not always like that, but it's very typical that now you actually start seeing this trend of something that we call micro VC or seed. They sometimes talk about lean startup, but also lean VC, where you can actually start with angel money. Like you get anywhere between 0 and 400K. And there's like a lot of angels, even here in India, you have Chennai angels and Mumbai angels and India angels and all sorts of angels. Or angels that put it more in a fund, like there's a fund that's actually started by an Indian Manu Sharma or Manu Kumar in the US called K9, and here we have Sharpalo. It's kind of like more driven by angel money. Then obviously you have incubators. Now incubators are, I wouldn't call it seed, it's still more early, and they don't just provide money, but they provide a lot of advice and support and mentoring. And you know, there's famous guys in the US like Y Combinator or Techstars. But then obviously in India, we have the Morpheus, we have the Startup Center, and we have a number of others. And then there's been VCs that actually announced or just did seed stage investments. So it has never been cheaper to do your startup. It's never been cheaper to experiment and to get going. And there's actually someone who's specifically, again, talked about Amazon's impact on this, and that's a guy called Steve Blank. He's one of the professors at Stanford. He wrote The 4 Steps to Epiphany and a number of other startups books, and has actually been a mentor to Eric Ries as well. And again, he talks about the impact specifically that Amazon has had on developers and on applications. So let's talk a bit about that part. Let's talk a bit about the impact that Amazon Web Services has had on startups. Now, when I speak with VCs and when I speak to startups, I always like to put myself in their shoes. So as Werner and Shane were saying earlier, Amazon Web Services is very customer obsessed. We always try and re-engineer back. So when I talk to a startup, I start thinking about what he goes through. What is his life cycle? He starts with an idea. It might be in that garage. At some stage, he needs to come out with a private beta or prototype or minimum viable product or demo if you're in an incubator and you have your demo day. After your demo day, what you hope that those crowds are coming, right? You hope that you're going to scale. And when you're at scale, you want to make sure that that scale is actually profitable, that you drive revenue and that you drive profitable revenue. But in each of these stages, what I see when I work with our startup customers is that there's different challenges, specifically if they're still on traditional IT infrastructure. So in those early stages, if you still have to buy servers to test something out and then it doesn't work and you need a different type of server, different CPU or RAM or whatever, you've invested in servers. So actually in that stage, in a traditional environment, you're often facing high cost of experimentation. Your time to market is impacting because you have to like spec out your hardware, staging, logistics, capacity planning and all that. And development cycles tend to be longer. That's not what you want. Let's say you manage that and you go out to market. Then it's like, oh gosh, what's going to happen? How much traffic is going to come? We don't know. It could be predictable, it could be small, it could be huge. You actually don't know what's going to happen. And you don't know how you can scale out or scale up. Then when it comes to monetization, you obviously want to have your revenue grow faster than your cost, right? You might not have the CapEx to do all sorts of investments, so you want to be much more lean and you want to be able to focus on your growth. So these are the areas that we're trying to address specifically with Amazon Web Services. So let's talk about what kind of is our value that we offer across these different stages of a life cycle. The first one, as you go from idea to demo or to minimum viable product, we're helping you to experiment more and develop faster. Develop your product faster and launch your business faster, and go to market faster and get to revenue faster. That's very powerful. Now, that's caused by a couple of different things. First of all, and again, we addressed this morning, you can now launch your infrastructure in a couple of clicks. And some guys in the panel were talking about that, how that has changed their business. Because again, the long times to order and get ready with your physical infrastructure is no longer there. A couple of clicks and you can go. Second, the cost of experimentation. We often talk about fill forward and fill forward faster, but it's also fill forward cheaper. You want to be able to try something out. If it doesn't work, you know what? You've spent $10 or $50 on Amazon Web Services on running a couple of servers, and with one couple of clicks, you can actually change it and try something else. So the cost of failure goes down. And finally, and Instagram is a good example, the whole open source movement and Amazon Web Services are pretty much intertwined, and there's an amazing community around there that comes up with advice, with tips, with code on GitHub or whatever. And we're actually actively part of that in a lot of community and forums and provide SDKs, libraries, and all these things to actually enable you to have a shorter development cycle. I've actually spoken with a lot of startups that start with the web and then start going mobile and are struggling and are not aware that we actually have full SDKs for Android, for iOS, that's just available on our website. And that when you start your business and you don't know how you architect on Amazon Web Services, we've actually worked over the years with so many customers in all sorts of specific use cases and verticals that we've actually learned a lot about best practices of how you build, how you architect on Amazon Web Services. So there's all these reference architectures available that you can go and have a look at. And actually, when you just start, you realize that you might not be there yet, but you know where you want to get to in terms of having the most reliable, the most scalable, the most cost-effective architecture. Now, there's a number of customers that have actually used this a lot in those early stages. Has anyone knows who this is? Which customer? Dropbox. Who's actually using Dropbox? That's a lot. Who knows that actually Dropbox is entirely built on Amazon Web Services? All right, quite a few people. They're actually pretty famous for going out with a minimum viable product that was actually more like a video that described the basic product. And then when the feedback was overwhelming, they launched and started releasing code multiple times a week and actually improved that product drastically over time. And now they're at multi-billion-dollar valuations. In India, we actually have a great example as well. And it's in a similar storage space, but more right now collaboration tools, Dhruva, who originally started much more as a physical infrastructure, only for the top end of the market. But they realized that there was so much potential in a broader base of the market, but that they could only reach that when they had something that was really scalable. So they actually started launching a new service called InSync, and Jaspreet Singh, their founder and CEO, has actually been really happy how that happened, because they were able to really launch very quickly and scale up very fast. And right now, InSync is the bulk of their business, not their traditional piece. Very exciting. Now, you've gone from ID to demo. Now you want to be able to scale. With physical infrastructure, scaling is often an issue. Your infrastructure is your barrier to further growth. With Amazon Web Services, that's not the case. You can scale to thousands of servers in minutes. You can actually fully automate that process with auto-scaling. You can put billions of objects in S3 as Dropbox is doing. And I think another interesting one from a scalability, and you normally you think of scalability of just like growing up or growing broader. If you think about something like CloudFront, we've seen customers in India that first address the Indian market, but then as soon as they want to go global, they can actually leverage just from their office here in Bangalore, they can start reaching customers globally, leveraging our content distribution, our CloudFront. So that's also about scale, but scaling your business and reaching new markets, pretty important. Again, there's some very interesting customers that have really leveraged that scalability. One of them is India Games. It's actually pretty much a success story in the sense that they got bought by a big American player, Disney. And they've actually realized how valuable Amazon Web Services is for scalable requirements. And when he talks here about scalable requirements, it's not just scaling up. It is every day they have tons of gamers coming on and then dropping off. And how can you scale up and down flexibly and fluidly is super valuable for any application that is mobile or social. We'll talk about that a bit more later on in one of the other presentations. Another one that's more a smaller startup still, because what I want to show is that we don't just work only with the Dropboxes of this world and with the Instagrams. We work with those guys. Like Dropbox started in Y Combinator when they were like two guys and didn't really know what they were doing yet. And we started working with them at that stage. Now here's a company that we also started working with when they're really small and they're much more early in the life cycle. But they launched at an event about half a year ago and grew to about 650,000 users, registered users, in 45 days. So they were signing up 10, 15, 20,000 users a day at some stage. And again, he's indicated how with AWS there's no limit to that skill. So pretty good example of how we enable that kind of explosive growth. Now, you got from idea to demo to your first product, you got the skill, now you want to monetize. We already talked about cost a lot in Kingsley Wood's session earlier, so I won't gonna talk about that. We talked about how often we lower our cost, or we have lowered our cost. We spoke about no capex. A key thing that we see to be very valuable for startups is this thing that sometimes within Amazon we refer to as the 70-30 rule. In a traditional environment, we see a lot of people spending 70% of their time on what we call undifferentiated heavy lifting, managing their infrastructure, managing the logistics, managing the hardware, the software licenses, whatever. And only 30% on actually growing their business, developing new applications, developing new features, trying out new things, new business models to generate revenue. With Amazon Web Services, that flips around completely. It actually becomes 30% on managing your infrastructure and 70% on your business. And actually what a lot of customers tell us is that it's not even 70-30 on AWS, it's more like 90-10. And if you look at it, Instagram again, 12 guys, 3 engineers. Out of that, actually 2 were back-end engineers, so only 2 guys that enable that. And even Dropbox has publicly said that they only have like 2 or 3 guys that actually manage the billions of objects that they run in S3. It's pretty exciting. So helping you to focus on your business and focus on growing revenue rather than managing your infrastructure is very, very powerful. And Werner talked about it as well, how a lot of people actually come to Amazon because of cost, but then when you speak to them after a year, what they say, the key thing that we got out of this is actually agility and speed. So that's pretty exciting. Pinterest. Anyone heard of Pinterest? It's a bit less famous in this part of the world, but they're actually one of the fastest growing web domains in the history of the web. It's pretty amazing. And they run a massive infrastructure on Amazon Web Services. Now what they've done really smartly is actually leverage the elastic nature of the cloud and some of the pricing mechanisms that Kingsley spoke about earlier in terms of reserved instances. So they know that you save when you stop using in any pay-as-you-use model, right? And also they know that most of the traffic happens in the afternoons and in the early evenings. So what they do is for their base workload, they have reserved instances. For the peak workloads, they have on-demand. And actually they automatically, using autoscaling, switch off about 40% of their instances every night. But because the reserved instance piece makes that the base workload is cheaper, that actually saves them about 71% if you look at the difference in cost per hour at peak and cost per hour off-peak. So again, leveraging a smart architecture, using auto-scaling and things like that, really making use of the elastic nature of the cloud, and then using the smart commercial models to actually achieve cost savings like this and still always have enough resources to serve your customer. Another one that has really been able to leverage Amazon Web Services from a cost point of view is Redbus. What I like about what their CEO said is he didn't look at like just apples for apples or apples for oranges as Kingsley was talking about, but he realized that it's not just like one server like on Amazon versus physical infrastructure. He talks about development cost, he talks about staff. He really takes this overall total cost of ownership perspective and then sees that he can save about 30 or 40%. So that's pretty significant, and I think it's a great example of someone in India that has done a great job in doing that. Now, with that, how are we as AWS actually enabling the startup ecosystem? What are we doing to act as a catalyst in that ecosystem and sometimes bring parties together and educate and train and so on? First of all, we're involved in a lot of third-party startup events. Anyone here in the room been to TechSparks in Bangalore a couple weeks back? Okay, so my apologies for those guys because they've seen some of this material because I was presenting there as well. And so is my colleague Joe that you've seen earlier. He was in the panel here. So we actively support, sponsor, add value to third-party events like that. Not just in India, but this is actually me on a panel at Echelon 2012, which is one of the largest tech and startup events in Singapore. Or even in Korea, which is interesting with the translation and all that, and it's pretty funny. So that's third-party events. But we also do a lot of events and a lot of training and enablement ourselves. So obviously we have things like this, like summits, where it is overall Amazon Web Services education and awareness, but specifically like this track focused on startup and developers. We have a very big user conference coming up in Las Vegas in November, where there will be a host of startup and developer activity, where we have a number of the key VCs in the US actually speaking and working with the startup customers that we have right there. And in Asia, we've done something really cool that's called the Lean Cloud. And the Lean Cloud is not just an event, but it's an entire campaign, an entire vision of how we want to be a catalyst for the startup ecosystem. And it does not just involve events, it also involves training, it involves a microsite, and it involves a whole host of activities. And we are doing the Global Startup Challenge that Werner mentioned earlier on as well. So there's a whole lot of things going on there. Now when it comes to training and enablement, again, some of that ties into the Lean Cloud campaign. For example, the beanbag sessions. We've done a number of these throughout Asia Pacific, and we've done a number of really successful ones here in India, where actually one of our colleagues did mentoring sessions with startups and with aspiring entrepreneurs. And actually, he hardly spoke about technology, he hardly spoke about cloud. He just leveraged his knowledge and his understanding of all the startups that he's worked with to help these guys understand what it is to run a startup and what are the things that you need to think about. Obviously, we talked a bit about Amazon Web Services and how we help startups, but it was very much focused on them, not as much on technology. On top of that, we have a whole range of other types of trainings around like AWS 101, which is more like a basic introduction to cloud, and technical training for kind of like AWS novices, as well as 201 training for more experienced people. Now, when I presented last week in Chennai and Mumbai, I had a lot of people come up to me and says, hey, how can we find out about this training? And you know, it's obviously hard with a country the size of India to reach everyone. I think the good part is, since you are here and you've registered and we now have your email address, whenever we do these trainings in India, you'll hear about it and you'll have an opportunity to attend, so that's pretty cool. Now, as I mentioned, I work with startups, but I also work in a more focused effort with some of the key hubs, the key areas where startups come together. That's obviously incubators and accelerators, right? So here, I just mentioned a couple of the global ones that I mentioned earlier, but also a number of the guys here in India. And the key focus, again, is provide very dedicated support, technical support, training to the startups that are in these accelerators. And we obviously work with a lot of the venture capital firms, where we try and make sure that they have access to the best resources in Amazon Web Services, and that we provide dedicated support to resources in Amazon Web Services, experts, solution experts, business development people that really know big data or really know storage, and so on. So with all these things, we're trying to help startups here in India leverage the power of the cloud, leverage the benefits that Amazon Web Services can provide you as you grow, as you go through the life cycle of your startup. So this is kind of like a presentation to kick off and set the stage for the rest of the startup and developer track. After my session, we'll hear from Joe Ziegler and one of our partners from ThoughtWorks around agile development on the cloud, which is really exciting. More around that part of scaling, we'll talk about how you architect your killer app on AWS or how you develop for your target market, specifically if you're social or gaming or a mobile app and you have really scalable requirements, how can we help you there? We have some more presentations on Microsoft on AWS. We have a presentation from Intel on big data. Normally we'll talk about total cost of non-ownership. We've had that session already, so we don't need to repeat that. But that gives you an overall view of all the things that you need to know and that can help you as a startup, as a developer across the life cycle. So with that, thanks a lot for your attention.